really writing this as a way to vent because I'm in a bit of a situation here and I feel really stuck. Any advice is appreciated, but I'm not sure there's anything that can be said that will actually help. I'm going to start from the beginning. This is a story 2 years in the making, so it'll be as thorough as possible. In 2019, I graduated with my master's degree and moved to a relatively rural area for my PhD. Thinking that we'd make an investment, the intent was to rent it out once I completed my PhD. This house was only a block away from a dive bar, where my dad was able to make some pretty good friends. He introduced me to everyone, and everyone let me know that I would be so happy in my new house, because the next-door neighbor was the absolute nicest guy you could ever meet. So we met the neighbor, and he did seem nice enough. He suggested that we exchange numbers in case I ever needed anything, and I thought that was a good idea. What's the worst that could happen? A few days later, my dad left to go back to his house in another state, and I was left to my own devices. Literally the day after he left, it started. My neighbor texted me while I was away and let me know that he had left a gift for me on the front porch. In this text exchange, he started using pet names like Sweetie and Cutie. When I got back home, I discovered he'd left a hand-painted feeding dish for my cats in my mailbox. At this point, I wasn't that alarmed. He was just being nice, I thought. The next day, he sent me more messages with pet names, and I took the opportunity to make sure he knew I was not interested in anything romantic. He replied back with a rambling message about how all a person ever needs is friends, and that he would like to be friends with me. After that, he would send me texts frequently, everything from inviting me to go fishing to telling me that he left more gifts on my porch. I would often not reply, or would tell him that I was busy. I didn't want to be rude, but I also had no interest in any sort of relationship with him, other than being neighborly. One night, I received a text from the manager of the bar down the street, letting me know that if my neighbor knocked on my door, I shouldn't answer. She then told me that my neighbor had walked down to the bar with a hatchet and told the bartender he was hearing voices that got louder as he approached the bar. He threatened to kill somebody with a hatchet if the voices didn't stop. They called the police, and the police confiscated the hatchet from him, but there were no arrests made. She told me that the police said my neighbor was on meth. After that night, I tried to keep my distance from him even more, but things only escalated from there. One day, I went out to my car to find a dead squirrel in my driveway. The squirrel had obviously been run over and was moved to be right next to my. I just stepped over it, got in my car, and left. When I returned home that day, the carcass was gone. Shortly after, I got a text from my neighbor that said, "Someone put a dead squirrel in your driveway. Don't worry, I moved it for you." I felt like this was a weird way to word this, and I suspected that he was the one who had put it there. Not long after this, I walked out of my house to see that he had placed an unspent shotgun shell on the bricks of his front yard. He came out and told me that served as a warning for anyone walking between our houses. For the next couple of months, I did my best to avoid him. He would text me, inviting me over, and I would always come up with some excuse, or just ignore him completely. I wanted to remain cordial since he was my neighbor, but to be honest, this was getting very annoying, and I was uncomfortable. He would text me as soon as I got home, telling me that he was watching me come and go from my house. Around Halloween, he handcrafted a large casket and wrote, "Here lies the last son of a bitch who played mind games. November 2012. What the fuck? And during this time, He was still sending me texts. Eventually, I got fed up with his bullshit and stopped replying completely. Less than 2 weeks after I stopped responding, he threw a 50-pound flower pot at my front door. I called the police, who advised me to get a no-contact order. A few days later, while I was watching TV, a notification popped up that my neighbor was trying to cast a video to my screen. I declined it and filed another police report. During this time, I had begun the process of getting a no-contact order from my neighbor. I saw 3 different victim advocates who told me different things. I went for an out-of-town conference, and during that time, someone had attempted to break into my house. I had a security system, so while they didn't succeed, I was aware that somebody had tried. After the conference, I came home to the entire world shutting down because of the pandemic, and I would be trapped in my home with my stalker right next door. Fortunately, the court proceedings for my protection order weren't delayed. Right before court, he sent me a text telling me that he was sorry for what he had done, and that he could tell when he saw me outside that he had made me feel uncomfortable. He then went on to say that he could tell my hair has gotten longer and I looked beautiful. None of this dissuaded my decision. I went to court and provided all the evidence I had, the timeline of the events, and laid out everything that had happened since I moved in. I told the judge that I suspected him of attempting to break into my house while I was out of town. The kicker was, he didn't deny any of it. He actually told the judge that he took full accountability for everything. He said that he was in recovery and was trying to turn over a new leaf. He didn't oppose the protection order at all. So, in March of 2020, he actually received the no-contact order for stalking. Everything was pretty quiet for a while. I mean, he still did some weird shit. But that's because he was just a weird guy. It wasn't anything that made me fear for my safety. That is, until he got on drugs again. At this time, we found another unspent shotgun shell casing in my flower bed. It was consistent with the one he had previously used to send a warning. This occurred a couple of months after I started dating my boyfriend, and I suspected it was a warning to him. Because of this, and for a variety of other reasons, my boyfriend moved in with me. The process was very quick, but everything turned out fine. We were still together, and were as happy as we could be with our relationship. On New Year's Eve of 2021, I was awoken by yelling. I turned on my security cameras and got footage of my neighbor sticking his head out of his window and screaming obscenities at my bedroom for about 7 minutes. That doesn't seem like a very long time, but when your stalker is screaming threats and obscenities, 7 minutes is an eternity. He said, "Happy fucking New Year," and then shouted that he was going to blow up his house with his gas line. I called the police, who responded. They told me that since he never said my name, I can't prove it was a violation of the protection order. The officer said, and I quote, "There's nothing illegal about yelling in your own house." They left without even talking to him. All I could do at this point was do my best to avoid him. I parked on the street because my driveway is pretty close to his front porch. I got used to living with my curtains drawn. I always made sure my cameras were charged. All 5 of them. I spent over $1,000 on those cameras. Every inch of my yard was covered. Since then, he has been seen by me and other neighbors talking to people who aren't there, going outside and screaming nonsense. Things like, "I have Cheerios on my necklace." I'm not even joking. This basically brings me to what happened last week. In the morning, I was getting ready for the day when I heard screaming, "Someone is going to die over this sweatshirt." I turned on the cameras and got footage of my neighbor walking around the alleyway behind my house, screaming, "Are you fucking proud? How about I go get my shotgun? I'll get everyone all fired up." I immediately called the police. Once again, they didn't charge him with a violation of the protection order. Instead, they gave him an ordinance violation for disturbing the peace. The police told me that it seems like he's off of his medication again, and that was that. They left. Last night, I was awoken to a hammering outside of my window at 1 a.m. He was cutting down his privacy fence. I called the police for a noise complaint, and they just told him to stop, and that was it. As I write this, he is still outside, continuing to cut down his privacy fence. This means the privacy fence only stands about 3 feet tall now. This was the one thing that made me feel relatively safe about hanging out in my own backyard. And now, that's gone. All I have to say is that I'm fucking tired. I just want to live in a house where I can be sure that my neighbor is not going to try to kill me, where I can feel confident that no one's going to try to break in. My boyfriend and I are currently trying to buy a new house, but it's been difficult. I'm a PhD student, and I'm not making very much money. Renting won't work because I have 4 cats, plus my partner's cat and dog. Finding a place to rent with so many animals is difficult, if not impossible. I refuse to rehome them, so it's partially my fault that I'm stuck in this situation. My dad has agreed to co-sign another mortgage, and I've gotten a second job. We should be able to save up enough money within a few months, but until then, we're stuck. I just don't know what else to do, and I figured that I would just write this to vent everything out. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. There's still so many instances that I've left out. I'm just so exhausted of this whole thing. When I was 15, I lived in a very rural area, about 20 minutes outside of an actual town. I was home from school alone one day when a white car pulled up in front of our mailbox and stopped. I was upstairs in my room, and I could see from my window, but I didn't know who was in the car. Whoever it was just sat there for several minutes without getting out of the vehicle. It was long enough to creep me out. They then drove away. We weren't super close to our neighbors, but we weren't miles and miles apart either. I remembered that one of our neighbors, a bit down the road, was selling their house. I chalked it up to a potential buyer having the wrong address, or was simply checking out the neighborhood, and I thought nothing else of it. Fast forward about a week or so. It was a Friday night, and I had gone downtown to see the premiere of a movie with my boyfriend at the time. I remember it was a special occasion, and I begged my parents constantly for weeks to push my curfew back so I could see this film. It would be over well past 1 a.m., and it took about 20 minutes to get home from there. They were reluctant, but finally agreed. When the movie was over, my boyfriend Jason and I walked slowly back to the truck. It was a very well-lit, safe area, so we stood around in the parking area, trying to push curfew for as long as possible. There weren't many vehicles around at the time, but I realized the car parked straight across from us was that same white car that I had seen at my house a week earlier. The engine was running, and there was a man sat in the driver's seat, maybe in his mid-30s, and he was just staring at us. But as I continued to look at him, he turned on his brights and sped out of the parking lot, almost running into Jason's truck in the process. I obviously had a horrible feeling about this, and asked Jason to take me home right away. As we pulled out, we saw the white car parked across the street from the movie theater. All the lights were off, but the driver was still inside. But thankfully, he didn't follow us, so we drove the rest of the way back to my house, a bit shaken. I had no idea at that moment, but this was the start of 3 long and torturous years of being stalked by this man. A while after the parking lot situation, the encounters became more frequent and stranger, and I hated to go anywhere alone at the time. I never knew when or where this person would pop up, or how much time passed between encounters. It became clear he was watching me all the time, because he only made himself known when I was alone, or with my boyfriend, never with my parents or any other friends.
I was worried that none of my friends would believe me for some reason, so I kept this.
Until one day, my friend Rachel, who lived 5 miles away from me, began telling me about this creepy guy who showed up at her house over the weekend. Rachel's father worked on Saturdays, so she was home alone with another friend of hers, Megan. Everything was normal until around dusk, when they began to smell cigarette smoke. My heart began racing when I heard that, because by this time, that was becoming an everyday occurrence for me. I was smelling cigarette smoke and finding cigarette butts around my house, even though no one in my family smoked, and I could never trace the source. I had a nagging feeling, of course, that Rachel's experience was connected to my stalker, but I had no confirmation. So, as Rachel and Megan were looking for the source of the smoke, Rachel realized that she had left a back window open, and the smell was coming in from the back porch. They peered through the window to see somebody standing on her back porch. She quickly goes to close and lock the window. She then explains that the man turns around and looks straight at her with his dead eyes. Megan immediately calls the police, as Rachel continued standing there, looking at the man in shock as he smirked at her. He finished his cigarette and calmly got up and walked away. The police came and found no trace of him, except for the cigarette butts he left on the porch and scattered around the backyard, indicating that he had been there for quite some time. I immediately began to describe the creep in the white car, and Rachel confirmed it was the same man. She hadn't seen a white car, guessing that he had parked it down the road and had walked down Rachel's almost mile-long driveway, or had navigated through the woods to get to her house. As time went on, my stories were well documented with the police department, but every time they came out, the man was long gone. I have to give them credit, though, because they never doubted the validity of my stories and always tried to show up quickly. As it was becoming apparent, this guy knew what he was doing and wasn't planning on being caught anytime soon. We also began to suspect that the man had a police scanner in his car. One night, almost 2 years after the Rachel incident, Jason and I were heading home a bit early from a date. My parents had gone out as well that night, and we had a strict rule that we couldn't be home alone with no adults. So Jason and I began to talk in the driveway, since my dad had called and said that they were about 20 minutes out. We were too scared, given the circumstances, to get out of the truck, and we kept our eyes peeled. But we figured 20 minutes wasn't that long. Not even a minute later, we saw headlights turn on in the bushes across the street from my driveway. This freak had backed his car into the bushes and waited for us to come home. Jason immediately called the cops, and I called my dad, who was literally flying home at this point. As the man revved up his engine and flashed his lights, he then proceeded to get out of his car and walked toward us. I'll never forget how he was so slow, methodical, and emotionless. It felt like he was living out his own slasher film. I was sobbing. We had all the doors locked, of course, as the man walked up to the passenger side where I was sitting and stood only a couple of feet away from my window, just staring at me. He never made a move for the door. He simply just stood there, completely still, and stared. His eyes were like black holes, Jason was a baseball player and had been keeping a bat in his back seat for moments, exactly like this one. He pulled me toward him and away from the window and grabbed his bat, but the man outside didn't flinch. He switched his gaze to the bat for a few seconds. Then a sinister, disgusting smile spread across his face. He then walked back to his car and drove away. It seemed like 40 minutes had passed, but it couldn't have been no longer than 5, because the man was gone for a couple of minutes before my dad drove into the driveway, doing about 80. The cops were unable to track him down that night. There's a lot more to this story, such as leaving dead animals outside of our front door and shining flashlights into our windows in the middle of the night. But nothing anyone did could trip this guy up. My family has tried everything. My older brother had even desperately tried to chase this man through the woods behind our house one night and lost him. The police wanted to help, but they had no idea who this man was, and I doubt a restraining order would have done me any good. Perhaps the creepiest part of all this was that in the 3 years that this was going on, he never spoke a single word. Then one day, just as quickly as he showed up, there wasn't a single trace of him. He had completely disappeared, just like that. I don't know if he died, or was arrested for some other crime, or just lost interest, even though that seemed highly unlikely. But we simply never saw him again, and it's been about 10 years. Stalkers come in all shapes and forms, and many times they do not look like what you see in the movies. They can be completely normal on the outside. However, this man's behavior was something exactly like what you would see in a horror film. There was something in his eyes that was pure evil, enough to make your stomach turn. He made my life extremely stressful and terrifying on a day-to-day basis. And even now, living in a different state, I sometimes have expect him to show up again. This was back around 2004, when online dating wasn't as prevalent as it is now. I had met and gone on dates with a few local guys, but nothing had come of it. One evening, when I was searching through profiles, I happened upon somebody who was my age and had almost identical tastes in music, hobbies, and interests as I did. I messaged him, and we started to chat. He seemed interesting enough, so we agreed to meet up for coffee downtown. I didn't notice anything off-putting at first, as we ordered our coffee and hung out for a while. We talked about mundane things, and I found out he was a medical student at a local university. He seemed like a normal guy, until we finished our coffee, and he told me he wanted to go for a walk around the city. It was around this time that I noticed his demeanor began to change. He seemed to grow tense, and he got this look in his eye. He kept rubbing his hands over his thighs, as if to dry off sweaty palms. He became very quiet, and I started to get nervous. I noticed that when we were strolling, he was leading me further and further away from the populated downtown area. My attempts to continue the conversation were met with half responses and mumbles. His behavior was becoming increasingly alarming. I suggested that we needed to go back toward the downtown area, and I turned around and started to head back in the other direction when he reached out and grabbed my arm. "No, wait. Can we sit down for a second? There's something important I need to tell you." Alarm bells were going off in my head like crazy. I knew that I had to get away from this guy, but by this point, we were far enough away from the downtown crowd that there would be nobody to come to my immediate aid. I was in shock, and I numbly allowed him to guide us over to a bench and sit down. He still had a hold of my arm. He stared at me in a way that I can only describe as a predator eyeballing its prey. He then proudly disclosed to me that he had been watching me for a very, very long time. He began to rattle off all this information that he had been gathering about me. He knew which bars I went to, and the friends that I would hang out with, what I liked to talk and laugh about with others, and that he would just hang back in the crowd, watching me. He knew where I lived, and he knew where and when I would work, what school I attended, and what classes I had. He said that he had been following me for quite some time, and then he said he found me on that dating site, and that he specifically tailored his profile to mirror mine so that he could finally get me. Still clutching my arm, he slid his hand over to squeeze my thighs. Now that I have you, I'm never going to let go. The whole time this guy was rambling, I was acting nonchalant and nodding like none of this was a big deal, while inside I was freaking out. I had discreetly pulled out my phone and was texting one of my guy friends that I was in danger and needed help, fast. One of them responded that he was in that area, and he raced over to where I was. My heart was pounding as I saw my friend's truck coming down the street. I waited until he was close enough, and I ripped myself away from the grip of the creepy stalker and began to run. The guy began chasing after me, screaming obscenities. I could feel that he was gaining on me, and I threw myself into the bed of my friend's truck, and he immediately sped away. The creepy guy was still on the sidewalk, shouting and swearing. This was the last time I fooled around with online dating. I have no idea what this creepy guy was intending to do, but I've never been more terrified in my life.